I want so much for simple things. Wellness, happiness, family togetherness. I wish I could answer why this is happening. Sometimes I really and truly feel like I'm going crazy. And why, when I am so surrounded with love, do I feel so alone? And right now, no one can say that I haven't tried. I have. I'm scared.
If you think about the worst you have ever felt in your life, and imagine feeling that way every day and not knowing why, then you'll know what depression is.
You feel it as anguish in your chest. You feel it in every one of your bones and ligaments. You feel a heaviness and moving.
Depression is a perplexing illness that takes many forms.
Depression tortures you every day with the idea that you suffer and somehow I ought to be able to do something about it, and I can't.
Depression is an illness of loneliness, and the primary experience is the feeling of being isolated, of being alone, of being cut off from everyone and everything.
It can strike early in life or as late as our twilight years. Trauma, loss, or neglect can lead to depression in those who are vulnerable.
Our therapy becomes the bottle. Our therapy become pills. Our therapy become crime, violence.
Genetics also plays a role.
The major risk factor is having a family history of depression.
Very anxious and very depressed because I don't think I can do this anymore.
Treatment is an ongoing process of trial and error.
If you can't talk it down, drug it down, shock it down, maybe you have to do something else in a much more bulleted kind of way, if you will.
Scientists are hard at work, piecing together a better understanding of the many faces of depression.
If someone can get the appropriate treatment and stay with it, the prognosis is actually very, very good.
Meanwhile, over 20 million Americans are living with depressive disorders, many of them terrified to step out of the shadows and seek help.
Funding for Depression Out of the Shadows has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding provided by the Ritter Foundation, Incorporated, and Mental Insight Foundation. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
I knew that the sun was rising and setting, but little of its light reached me. I felt myself sagging under what was much stronger than I. First I could not use my ankles, and then I could not control my knees, and then my waist began to break under the strain, and then my shoulders turned in, and in the end I was compacted and fetal, depleted by this thing that was crushing me without holding me. I had thought that when you feel your worst, your tears flood, but the very worst pain is the arid pain of all used up. The pain that stops up every space through which you once metered the world, or the world you. This is the presence of major depression.
Andrew Solomon became an expert and best-selling author on the subject of depression after enduring several debilitating episodes of major depression that started in his 30s.
I always say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality, and that depression has to do with finding all of life totally overwhelming. It's a poverty of the English language that we only have that one word, depression, that's used to describe how a little kid feels when it rains on the day of his baseball game, and that's also used to describe why people spend their lives in mental hospitals and end up killing themselves. But clinical depression really has to do with the feeling that you can't do anything, that everything is unbelievably difficult, that life is completely terrifying, and a feeling of this free-floating despair, which is overpowering and horrifying.
Andrew's first major episode of depression came without warning.
I was going about my ordinary life. It was right when I was publishing my first novel, and it had kind of nice reviews, and I just didn't care. And I remember thinking, that's so strange that this is happening and I don't care, but I just didn't. My closest friend threw a wonderful book party for me, and I remember walking into that party and feeling as though it was so hard just to walk in there, and all these people were coming up and they were excited for me and excited to be there and they wanted to talk, and I couldn't hold them in focus. I was sitting there and they were kind of, I could see them and then I suddenly couldn't see them anymore, and it was just as if I was surrounded by this big blur. And then the anxiety began. I was terrified all the time, but I didn't know what I was terrified of, so there was nothing I could do about it. It was like that feeling if you've slipped and tripped in that second before you fall flat on your face on the floor. And it was like that all the time, 24 hours a day. And I finally got to the point at which it was too frightening for me to move out of my bed, and I was just sitting there in this huddled mess.
Desperate for help, Andrew turned to his father.
My father said to me to move back in, and I thought, I can't move into my father's house. I'm 30 years old. How can I be doing this? But I did it. I moved back in, and he was incredibly caretaking. And I remember sitting there and being too tired and too overwhelmed to cut up the meat on my plate, and my father cutting up my meat for me the way that I sometimes do for my nephew who's 6. And by saying to my father, I can't believe I have to ask you to do this.
Andrew's breakdown was cushioned by the support of his family. But it was the loss of his mother to cancer 3 years earlier that he believes significantly contributed to his depression.
I knew that the loss of my mother was a cataclysmic loss, and I really experienced a lot of my own happiness in the context of her happiness, because when something went really well for me, she would be so incredibly happy for me, and that would magnify my own happiness so much. And when she died, it was as though I had lost that sounding board.
Facing a painful terminal illness, Andrew's mother made the decision to end her life on her own terms.
She had a couple of prescriptions of Seconal that had been written for her, and we all went into her room, and she spread them out on her bed. And I remember thinking they looked almost like some kind of a game, all of those red pills spread out on the counterpane. And she began taking them a few at a time. And she had thought through exactly what she wanted to say to each one of us. And she looked at my father and she said, even with this ending, she said, I wouldn't change this life for any other life in the world. And then she looked around at all of us and she said, I've looked for so many things in this life. So many things, and all the time paradise was in this room with the 3 of you. And then she closed her eyes. And that was the last thing she said.
In some cases, the loss of a loved one can be a tipping point into depression.
Depression is a biological disorder. It's not all in your head. But the triggers of depression, and whether you have an episode and when you have an episode or an onset, are probably related to environmental factors. And those are loss of attachments and stress and loss in your life.
For Emma, the onset of her depression was not tied to a single event. Her symptoms unfolded early, beginning at age 11.
I started feeling kind of lonely and just separate from the other kids. I thought all my friends were feeling the same way, that it was just kind of a part of life and that I was just weak because I couldn't deal with it.
The onset of clinical depression most typically presents itself between the ages of 15 to 34, but the disease is often missed in adolescence because it can be mistaken for normal teenage behavior.
I mean, they talk about on those depression surveys, have you lost interest in things you used to enjoy? And I never really understood that because I didn't remember ever enjoying anything. It's like, you know, the Dementors in Harry Potter, how they kind of suck all the happiness out of you. They suck all your good memories. It's like the world goes cold.
When we're talking about clinical depression, we mean depression that goes on for several weeks, in which the symptoms happen almost every single day. So what are these symptoms? There's feeling sad and blue, feeling guilty, feeling hopeless and helpless, having problems of sleeping and eating, and feeling life is just not worth living.
You imagine as a parent that it would never happen to your kid. Here we are, an intact family, no divorce, no history of depression.
Emma masked behavior she herself did not understand.
I don't know how much I necessarily, lied to them, necessarily, before things started getting really bad. I just wasn't completely honest. I started getting depressed in, 5th grade, and I didn't say anything until I was about to be a sophomore in high school.
The signs that you would look for, like doing bad in school or being isolated, the stuff you would read in a textbook, we didn't see anything like that. It was just, on the surface, everything was doing great. And then it was like a meteorite just smashed into our house.
I was really good at playing the role that I felt like I was supposed to play.
So that's the trap I think parents can fall into, which is we have such high expectations of our kids. The kids meet those expectations outwardly, even while they're crumbling inwardly.
As time went on, Emma's symptoms escalated. To the outside world, she was just a teenager acting out.
I started drinking. That kind of got a little bit out of hand. My friends told me that I was drinking too much, and they told me to try to stop drinking. And I found that it wasn't easy to stop drinking, so I started smoking pot a lot. And I was going to take a bottle of Tylenol and slit my wrists or something along those lines. But instead, I was like, no, you have to do something about this. And I basically went downstairs and told my dad, I was just like, I want to kill myself. And he was kind of trying to talk to me well, what's going on? Why do you feel so sad? And I just started screaming and crying, and I just fell over onto the floor, and he picked me up, kind of holding me up so I wouldn't drag on the floor, and was like, what did you take? What did you take? And I was like, I didn't take anything. This is me sober. I mean, he still thinks I was high that night when we talked, but I was just so horribly depressed.
This was a turning point. Emma's parents sought psychiatric help, supported by medication. When those therapies failed, they resorted to inpatient hospitalization.
While I was in treatment, I was mad at the counselors for something, and I was screaming and, throwing a temper tantrum on the floor. And the staff, dragged me into the living room, and I tried to strangle myself with my sweatshirt cords. And the staff had me to hold for, the rest of the night, and I attacked several staff members. And I don't really even remember it.
When treatment at the local hospital failed, the family felt they had no other recourse but to send Emma away to a specialized residential facility.
I think the hardest part was when we were just kind of hitting a wall, and Emma had been hospitalized several times, coming to the conclusion that we had to look at other options, and we spent some time working with a national educational consultant looking at different residential programs. And for a parent, that was one of the hardest things imaginable, to think that the person you love so much and that you were so devoted to was someone that you could not really care for anymore.
And to send her away when she was ill, that was the worst thing, to drop your child off in another state when you think her life is in danger, and to drive away is nearly impossible to do. It was, but we also felt like it was the only chance we had left. We had tried everything else.
Unlike Emma, some cases of depression can be so severe that they're impossible to miss. Hart Lipton's world began to close in on him in 6th grade.
For me, it was going to sleep, just locking myself in my room. I just felt like there was no escape, just like a black hole. Once you come in there, you just can't come back out, just blackness.
In time, Hart's depression spiraled even deeper. Although he was under the close watch of his parents, he became afraid that he might end his life and asked to be taken to a hospital.
My husband made a surreally slow motion trip to a hospital, following the ambulance that was carrying him. The lights were quietly flashing, but there was no siren. My perfect child seemed to want to sacrifice himself.
I brought these two kids into the world, and for one of them to not enjoy life, to be tired of life itself, and to not want to participate in life, is there nothing else even matters. It's the saddest thing that I could ever hear.
Hart Lipton suffers from bipolar illness, a disorder related to depression or unipolar depression. Bipolar illness manifests itself in a variety of ways and is characterized by moods which can swing dramatically between depression and euphoria or between depression and a more intense irritable state.
Bipolar disorder is one of the most heritable psychiatric illnesses. And in fact, bipolar disorder is what we call more heritable than is unipolar depression, okay? So the genetic part of bipolar disorder is particularly strong.
Multiple conflicting symptoms in Hart made his diagnosis especially challenging. He displayed signs of attention deficit disorder, which his doctor suggested might be contributing to his depression.
Teenage and adolescent behaviors are complex and scary and defiant, but there was a point at which we had to accept that he was really starting to be in pain.
Hart began therapy and was put on an antidepressant. He was also given medication for attention deficit disorder, which made his depression worse and was discontinued. Hart, seeking relief, turned to cutting.
You can see my wrists. They've been cut too. I tried it. Some people get a kick out of it. Hurting yourself. You feel this pain and you don't feel this pain so much.
By 9th grade, Hart's self-destructive behaviors forced his parents to monitor his every move.
They just have to be kept safe, and you have to take away anything that could be used to hurt themselves. Knives, medicine, all those kinds of things. And I think, in a way, it feels very regressive, almost like you're never going to have your independence again.
You would sit, like all day, you would just be wondering, are you going to hear from him that he's suicidal that day? Is he actually, talk to your son about, is he feeling like hurting himself?
The Lipton family put their life on hold, watching and waiting. They knew the threat of adolescent suicide was very real. Jed Satow took his life his sophomore year in college. Just 20 years old, he may have suffered from undiagnosed depression.
He was dating a girl and she broke up with him that evening, and that was the trigger that caused him to take his life.
Suicide is the second leading cause of death among college students. Within the general population, it is far more common than people realize.
Suicide is almost twice as common as homicide in the United States. We have roughly 30,000 suicides a year, and 90% of those are associated with mental illness, most commonly depression.
Jed grew up in a close-knit family and was well-liked by his peers. But he sometimes showed signs of anxiety, impulsiveness, and anger that worried his parents.
So many people said, oh, don't worry, he'll grow out of it. I knew so-and-so who was like that, and my goodness, it was much worse, and he grew out of it.
It was very, very difficult as a parent to make that decision, whether does it really require treatment, and if so, what sorts of treatment? Or is it really adolescence that we're seeing, and he's an aggressive adolescent, and that's all it is?
The Satows had not been informed about depression during Jed's high school years.
You have countless parent nights about alcoholism and drugs, but no one really ever brought up to us, and I felt we lived in a fairly sophisticated world. You know, you might be dealing with depression.
Here at the National Institute of Mental Health, neuroscientists and longtime collaborators Dr. Jay Geed and Dr. B.J. Casey have taken on the challenge of depression and are beginning to unlock some of the mysteries of the adolescent brain. New evidence shows that anxiety can be an early warning sign for depression.
It's rare that you have a depressed child that doesn't have some symptoms of anxiety, and it's also the case that individuals with anxiety have some symptoms of depression. But it's very hard to diagnose during childhood and adolescence too, and I think that's part of the problem, is picking up on the symptoms.
Using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, Drs. Geed and Casey have discovered dramatic and ongoing changes in the structure and function of the adolescent brain. This was a major breakthrough. Until recently, the adolescent brain was considered to be fully mature by the age of 18. But Dr. Geed's research shows that the brain continues to grow and refine its connections well into adulthood.
It really shocked us when we started looking at the brain development, that it wasn't 16 or 17 or even 18, but that well into the 20s, the brain was still undergoing dynamic changes, particularly in the front part of the brain involved in regulating emotions and controlling impulses.
Dr. Casey's research further revealed that the emotional centers of the brain have the upper hand during this critical period of development when teenagers are exploring their world. And it's not until the prefrontal cortex fully matures in the mid-20s that greater reasoning and judgment are able to modify the more turbulent thoughts and feelings of adolescence. Hoping to pinpoint a predictable marker in the brain's shifting landscape, Dr. Casey zeroed in on the amygdala, an almond-shaped node deep in the brain that plays a critical role in processing emotion. In a simple experiment, anxious adolescents were exposed to pictures of fearful faces. Casey observed that their emotional center was overactive. This heightened emotional state lasted far longer than that of healthy volunteers.
The reason why we're interested in this heightened activity in the amygdala in individuals who rate themselves as highly anxious is because in depression and anxiety, elevated activity in this region has been linked to the disorder. And so this may be a marker for those individuals who will be at risk, and you want to make sure you're monitoring them.
And make sure you're treating the right illness, whether it is bipolar illness or depression.
Quite often, someone who has manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder, their first episode is depression, and the young person presenting in front of you may look identical, and you don't have a lot of ways to distinguish are they unipolar or bipolar. And the reason it's so important is that the treatment for depression, namely an antidepressant, could aggravate the bipolar illness. It can trigger manias, it can cause rapid cycling, etc.
We made this chart.
For the Lipton family, tracking and carefully monitoring Hart's moods gave them a clearer picture. This daily chart became a tool that would lead to the successful diagnosis of bipolar illness.
It's very good for the parents to be giving it a little rating every day, just write on a calendar. Today the irritability was a 5, which is like the worst it ever is, or today it was a 3, which isn't too bad. And the physician can look it over and make very systematic decisions. So every case should be treated very scientifically, if you will.
Here he's feeling really, really bad.
Hi, this is my mom. I think you've seen her before. Say hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom.
Childbirth is another common time for depression to occur. 1 out of 8 mothers will develop postpartum depression, which doctors believe may be triggered by the dramatic shift in hormonal levels that women experience around the time of pregnancy. Ellie Zulke's husband, Jeffrey, captured her depression on video while documenting the first weeks of their baby's life.
I think I just felt so guilty and terrible. I expected it to be love at first sight. I expected to have this overwhelming love for him, and I just felt nothing. You get this sensation of like, well, if this is the way it's going to be, then why bother? Because this is horrible. This feels terrible, and I'm not a good mom. I'm not a good wife. So just a lot of feelings of fear and hopelessness, I guess.
Ellie Zulke was struck with postpartum depression 13 days after her son Graham was born. Women experience all types of depression at twice the rate of men.
One possibility, it has to do with the different hormonal and endocrine makeup of women.
Ellie had trouble sleeping, a common symptom of depression.
She was really out of her senses. She really just so desperately wanted to sleep, and that set up a cycle of real high anxiety, anticipating the night with such dread because she anticipated being awake. And I think the sleep deprivation compounded the insecurity she felt at being a new mother for the first time.
How you doing, Mom?
Mom's having an okay day. I've been struggling with postpartum depression since he was almost 2 weeks old. And I can't believe it's been that long. Several times when I wanted to die. Yesterday I wanted to kill myself because I don't think I can do this anymore.
One thing that happened to me is I had what they call intrusive thoughts, which are really scary thoughts about hurting your baby or hurting yourself.
Intrusive thoughts can often include things like seeing your child hurled against a wall, or seeing yourself throw your child down the stairs. It's something that's so jarring because it goes against how you see yourself and becomes quite shameful.
I thought, oh my God, they're gonna call child protection, they're gonna take my baby away, I can't tell my husband, he's gonna think I'm a lunatic. And you begin to question yourself, gosh, am I crazy? Am I going off the deep end? What's going on here?
Ellie had difficulty finding a doctor who she felt confident could help her.
I remember leaving that first psychiatrist's office feeling even more defeated and more scared because I felt like, oh gosh, if he doesn't understand what's going on, this is just tough, this is just part of being a new parent, then it must be hopeless. Then if he can't help me, nobody can.
A friend recommended Dr. Kim, an expert on postpartum care, who helped to allay Ellie's fears about her intrusive thoughts.
It's important for women to know that the intrusive thoughts and images are common. Violently acting them out is exceptionally rare. Other women have experienced the same thing, that there's a name for what troubles me, and more importantly, that there's something I can do about it.
As researchers try to understand the causes of depression, they have discovered a complicated dynamic between genetics and the environment.
We all have a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is determined by two major factors. Genetic vulnerability, which accounts for about 1/3 of risk for depression, and what I would call environmental perturbations, which would include early life trauma, child abuse and neglect, experiencing traumatic events as a child and young adult, poverty.
Surgeon and award-winning author Dr. Shep Newland believes that childhood trauma played a significant role in his illness.
Growing up with my father was unimaginably difficult. In the first place, here I was, a small boy of immigrant parents who couldn't read and write English, and all I wanted was to be an American. All I wanted was to be in this world and know this language and read these books. And my father, to me, when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, and even in my teens, was a Yiddish albatross around my neck. And then, of course, there was his temper, which would erupt in public places. Obviously, it would often erupt at home, but when I say erupt, that's a deliberately chosen word because it was so explosive and so unexpected, unpredictable. And to me, my father was the epitome, not just of failure, but of someone who looked ludicrous to the rest of the world, someone who seemed worthless to the rest of the world.
An ever-present dread of his father's moods made for an uneasy childhood. And then, at age 11, he lost his beloved mother. Despite these hardships, Shep rose from his immigrant ranks to attend college, and later Yale Medical School. He experienced a minor setback with depression during this time, but managed it with a few therapy sessions. Then, in his late 30s, his marriage of 12 years came undone. Its dissolution threw him into a dark despair.
Is there any human being who has ever lived who doesn't have such dark thoughts from time to time? Is there any human being who has ever lived who hasn't developed ways of getting out of those dark thoughts? And for most of us, those ways are somewhat efficient. But for some of us, those ways are self-contradictory. They just make things worse. And the more obsessional one is, the more one gets trapped in these convoluted notions of how to get out of the entrapment. They just go deeper and deeper and deeper, and there I was. I was chained. Everything about my mind was chained. And I knew something desperate had to be done.
The year was 1973. Despite the stigma of mental illness and the repercussions it could have on his life and career, Shep felt he had no other option but to check himself into a psychiatric hospital. Like Shep Newland, Deshaun Jawi Morris was also a victim of childhood trauma. Jawi is a member of the Bloods, one of the most violent gangs in America. Growing up on the streets of Newark, New Jersey, he and his friends have been involved in some of the city's more violent encounters.
It's just like you go to war. You don't know that you're gonna come home. You go in there and you fight it the best you can and you hope you make it up out of there. And that's what it is for a lot of us on the street. A lot of my homies, a lot of older homies that I know, a lot of my elders, a lot of these cats don't want to live this lifestyle, but what else is there to go through? So you learn to take that, internalize that, and make it work for you. So you be the baddest SOB you could be.
Jawi has suffered from early life trauma, which planted the seeds for his later depression. He was born into a world of neglect and abandonment, with an absent father and a drug-addicted mother. At age 9, Jawi was sent, along with his siblings, to live with relatives in Arizona.
My mother was supposed to actually come with us, but she sent us. You know, 1 month turned to 3 months, 3 turned to 5, you know, and she hadn't showed.
You don't even have to think psychologically to think that if you're very young and there's nobody there for you, the sense of helplessness and the sense of hopelessness and the collapse that you feel, you know, it induces depression.
Like many children left on their own, Jawi adopted his peer group as his surrogate family.
Phoenix is infected with gangs. You know, there's a lot of gang activity going on out there. So, you know, when you step outside your household, this is what's out there waiting for you.
It didn't take long for gang members to come calling. Jawi's initiation into the Bloods took place when he was just 11 years old.
When you want to fit in and be accepted, you don't know what your limits are. And again, at that age, you know, I really didn't understand the importance of what killing was. The gun is chrome with black electrical tape around the handle. Seconds before the showdown, with hands and fingers positioned around the gun, my anxiety thickens. I stick my head out the window, aim, and meet the eyes of the fool closest to the curb. Pop, 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 pop. Crips start running every which way. Somewhere around my third shot, I feel like I'm playing Duck Hunt on a Nintendo. Everything seems to reduce in speed. I feel a connection that no other feeling can replace. Jubilation at its purest and ripest form. It's the utmost penalty man can physically give and receive, and I'm behind it. I now got the power. I knew what I had done was wrong. I'm feeling bad inside, but I'm getting praised for it. that was my first day from separation from myself. Like, from that day forward, things changed for me because I knew what respect was. I knew how to get respect, and I knew how to equate respect and love and power, or I could put that all in one, and that was violence.
Take a walk into the dark side and feel our pain. See, what I call a family, you call it a gang. My brother Tim shot 9 times right in the street. My homeboy Mega killed the very next week. And you can't understand why I'm depressed and I don't get no sleep.
By age 13, Jawi found himself back in his old New Jersey neighborhood.
Gangbanging put Lil Duty in the coma. Put a bullet through Tank neck. R.I.P. he crossed over. Jawi, war the bloods in my veins. It's a wrap.
Even though the life we living the life we living, they ain't necessarily got to choose that route.
The mortality rate among young people like Jawi is frighteningly high. We come from a background, or most of us come from a background where you expect to live to when you're in the 70s or 80s and so on. These kids, you know, the idea is they may not make it to 20, you know, but making it to 25 or 30, it's like, you know, they don't even think about it.
While violence is not usually associated with depression, suicidal impulses or risky behavior can be manifestations of the illness.
On a few occasions, me and a couple of my partners, we would load up a 38, leave one bullet in, and we would really, I've done it about 6 times in my life, and we would really like take this game, take it seriously, get liquored up and really like test our fate. All the while, we was living suicidal every single day of our lives because we was out on these streets with people getting murdered every day. It's just a different form of suicide, and that's what we said, when you gangbang, it's just a form of suicide as well.
Jawi's violent lifestyle caught up with him at age 23.
I went to jail facing attempted murder charge. My back was against the wall. A good comrade of mine was murdered in my neighborhood. I was fed up with it. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired.
6 months later, Jawi would be released from prison. He felt something had to change. He contacted Terry Williams, the author of an article about the influence of the environment on criminal behavior. Jawi hoped that she could empathize with his predicament. What he didn't know was that Terry had also struggled with depression and would later prove to be the pivotal figure in his recovery. Terry Williams started out as a social worker and later became public relations agent to some of Hollywood's top celebrities, including Eddie Murphy and Miles Davis. A few years after launching her public relations business, Terry's energy and drive began to fade. She was suffering from a mild but chronic form of depression called dysthymia.
Here you are landing another major name, and you really just don't feel it anymore. And it was the having to pretend that I was excited about signing them, and I really wasn't, because I was really, I was dying inside.
Dysthymia affects millions of Americans and often goes unrecognized, as was the case for Terry.
Oftentimes when we talk about depression, we're talking about very severe depression. I've had patients say to me, I'm so depressed I can't answer the phone because the phone seems like it weighs 100 pounds. On the other end of the extreme, but still pathological, is a low-grade, smoldering, bad depression. It's not as so severe that you can't work or go to school, but it's there.
An estimated 10 to 15 million Americans live with dysthymia, a condition that is characterized by symptoms that persist for 2 years or more. Terry's symptoms included fatigue, trouble concentrating, and compulsive overeating.
So I would come home, eat junk food, all times of the night. At some point, the food wasn't enough, and I would just weep, and it was frightening to me. Because during those moments, I just felt that this was the end of the world, and I was having what I understood to be a nervous breakdown.
Terry sought professional help, which included medication and talk therapy.
There's power in naming it. Do you know, I remember when my psychiatrist said to me, you are clinically depressed. I almost felt like something inside of me jumped up. It's like, oh, thank you. You put a name to this, and it's something that's treatable.
For 30 years, Terry lived with the symptoms of depression, but never fully realized the seriousness of her illness. Terry believes stigma, which she sees as pervasive in the African American community, played a role in the denial of her condition.
Many of us would rather tell somebody that we have a relative in jail or on drugs before we will ever utter mental illness.
Terry believes that persistent racism contributes to feelings of hopelessness among African Americans.
You get used to feeling bad, that you think that that's how you are supposed to feel, that you are supposed to carry the world on your shoulders and not complain. That's how so many black men and women have come to feel.
Philip Bugere can relate to Terry's experience. He too soldiered through low-grade depression and fell prey to its stigma, which he believes is acute among corporate executives.
I am in the 6th month of my tenure as CEO of a Fortune 100 company. My mind seems to have taken on a life of its own, distant from my physical body, but the effects on my body are evident. I have sleepless nights, and the smallest of things agitate me. I want out, but I am stuck because I have never quit anything in my life. I functioned with low-level depression for a couple of years and functioned pretty well. You know, there's a term called fake it till you make it. You know, I kind of faked it for a long period of time.
Once the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company, Philip twice took million-dollar companies and turned them into multi-billion-dollar enterprises.
When I ran Cameron Ironworks, I had a mistress. And I would actually sneak out on Sunday mornings and tell my wife I got to run to the grocery store, and I'd go to work for 2 hours. And so my mistress that I would sneak out to was my work.
For 16 long years, Philip buried himself in his work, ignoring his symptoms, until he collapsed in his office from a severe panic attack.
Literally almost overnight, it was, I can't handle it anymore. It was a grade A, level 10 depression. I mean, like an atomic bomb went off. And that's when I, you know, guess had the sense to check myself into a mental institution because I could no longer handle it.
The Wall Street Journal and Houston Chronicle cited stress-related reasons for his abrupt departure. The public humiliation he felt and his company's plummeting stock only added to his distress.
I was 100% convinced that my wife and my 2 children would be better off without me.
Safe in a hospital, he met another patient who encouraged him to speak out.
She looked me right in the eyes and she said, "Philip, I'm not going to make it." She said, "But you are." And she said, "I want you to promise me something. When you make it, I want you to promise me that you'll tell your story because you can help other people."
Philip took his story public in Houston before a group of business leaders. This action inspired executives the world over to seek his advice about their own battles with depression.
In fact, I tried 5 different medications, and just you could almost go down the list, and every one of them caused my anxiety level to go through the roof. So my experience in the people that I work with, executive level, etc., it's about 50%. Will sometime during their career suffer from a serious clinical depression.
The consequences of untreated depression can be severe. Every year, there are approximately 650,000 reported suicide attempts in America, as Philip knows only too well.
I got a call from a gentleman here in Houston, worked for one of the biggest companies in the world. He had loaded a gun and put it to his head and cocked it, and he called me the next day. And of course, I did everything I could to get him in a hospital that afternoon, which I did.
In an odd twist of fate, Philip would discover that the act of encouraging others to seek treatment would later help him in his own recovery.
I don't know the name of it, but yeah.
Most cases of depression are treatable, and yet only about 50% of people experiencing depression seek help. For Andrew, a complex mix of medications is one component of his treatment.
That's Remeron. It's an atypical antidepressant. It supplements the effect of the other antidepressants. That's Zoloft. That's my primary antidepressant, an SSRI. This is Wellbutrin. Wellbutrin is also an antidepressant, but it's also somewhat stimulating, and some of the others are sedating. That's Zyprexa. It's an atypical antipsychotic, which is also useful in control of anxiety associated with depression. This is Namenda. It's actually an Alzheimer's drug, but it has some mild antidepressant effects, and it's sometimes helpful with the cognitive slowdown you can get from the Remeron and Zyprexa. That's ranitidine. It counteracts the weight gain effects associated with the Remeron and Zyprexa. That's one kind of fish oil. I take 2 kinds. That's my morning.
Antidepressant medications have been around for over 50 years. There are currently about 25 approved drugs to choose from, all of which target mood-influencing chemicals in the brain. In the healthy brain, each of the neurons release chemicals called neurotransmitters that communicate with adjacent cells. They function like an elaborate circuit board. In the depressed brain, it appears that some neurotransmitters, like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, stop working properly and communication breaks down. When that happens, symptoms of depression start to manifest themselves.
There's not a single neurotransmitter that's responsible for all of those symptoms, namely the fatigue and trouble concentrating and decreased memory and decreased libido and inability to experience pleasure. That's not a single neurotransmitter, but we do know that there is a relative serotonin deficiency in many patients with depression. We know that norepinephrine appears to be dysfunctional in depression, and more recently we've learned that dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter involved in the ability to experience pleasure, is also awry in depression, and other neurotransmitters as well.
Many antidepressants, like Zoloft and Prozac, work in a similar way, targeting malfunctioning neurotransmitters and restoring communication. This process can take 6 to 8 weeks, a long time for a person seeking relief.
The Cronsons are coming.
For some people, a single drug isn't enough to restore the brain's balance. It took Andrew nearly 6 years of trial and error to arrive at the right medications with the fewest side effects. He believes that he would not need as many pills today if he had started on medication sooner.
Sometimes I look at this whole thing full of pills and I think, over the next month, I'll eat all of those pills, and just the quantity of them completely overwhelms me. It seems like so much stuff. And I look at them when they're in my hand like that, and I think to myself, that's what stands between me and insanity. It's a very unsettling experience.
Finding the right drug is a trial and error process that many patients go through, as Andrew's psychopharmacologist knows only too well.
So if you walked in my office and said, my sister was depressed, and she really did well on Effexor, that would be a reasonable guess because, you're biologically and genetically related to your sister. But if you walked in my office and said, no one in my family has ever been depressed, I've never been depressed, it's the first time I've ever had this happen, and you said to me, how do I pick an antidepressant then? I could literally flip a coin.
I was going through a period of feeling a little...
In addition to regular checkups with Dr. Friedman, Andrew makes weekly visits to a talk therapist. Talk therapy used in conjunction with medication is 70 to 80% effective in most patients. New evidence shows that the act of talking, like medication, also produces changes in the brain, impacting a group of regions including the frontal area and the hippocampus, which is associated with learning and memory. Talk therapy also has the added value of providing patients with concrete skills to challenge negative thoughts and establish healthier ways of thinking. Early intervention is also critical to the treatment process.
Your first episode is bad, wait till you get to your 7th episode. And in the same way that if you had a heart condition, you would take medication in order to avoid having persistent heart attacks, because those persistent heart attacks would eventually do you in. Every time you have a depressive episode, you have lesioning of cells in your brain, you have a breakdown of mental functioning.
Talk therapy is a primary way to reduce stress, a major risk factor in depression. It is thought that the stress hormone cortisol may cause nerve cell death or shrinkage.
There's a lot of controversy in the field about whether there's actually neuronal death associated with depression. And there is evidence that stress in the presence of a lot of cortisol, which is the adrenal hormone that's hypersecreted in depression, can cause shrinkage of neurons and maybe even cell death.
Illuminating new studies of the brain have shown that the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are smaller in some patients with depression. But it appears that antidepressants might actually reverse the damage.
In contrast, antidepressants increase the rate in which neurons actually are born and grow. So the idea has been suggested that depression is in part a disease where neurons in the hippocampus are degenerating, dying, or shrinking, whereas antidepressant treatment actually reverses that process. And that's a viable hypothesis. It's just not yet proven.
What has been proven in animal studies is that exercise stimulates nerve cell growth in the hippocampus, which might explain exercise's positive impact on depressed patients. For people with mild depression, exercise alone can dramatically reduce the symptoms of depression. For others, like Andrew, it has become an essential component of his treatment.
I think medication and certain kinds of talk therapy seem to have the most proven record, but it's not as though there's one thing that works for everyone. But keep questing and keep looking until you get to the point at which you can function again, and try whatever there may be.
In the case of Hart Lipton, he switched to an alternative school where he now gets intense personalized attention. His irritability and rapid cycling moods led his parents and psychiatrists to recognize that he has a form of bipolar illness called bipolar II disorder. It is characterized by intense irritability and severe depressive episodes. His treatment includes an antidepressant and a mood-stabilizing medication that is commonly prescribed for bipolar illness.
In the long run, the medicine has probably saved my life. Straight up.
After spending 15 months in a treatment facility out of state, Emma returned home and is doing much better. Her treatment for depression includes weekly talk therapy and a single antidepressant. She tried 7 different medications before finding one that worked.
I am glad that I stuck with it, though, because the med now, I mean, it's certainly not a miracle pill, but it does take the edge off enough so the down days aren't quite as down, and my mood doesn't fluctuate as much, and I don't feel as anxious, and it's easier to stay positive and work in therapy when just the edge is off a bit, but I certainly wouldn't call it a miracle pill.
The use of medications in adolescence is not as well researched as in adults and should be cautiously prescribed and continuously monitored. There is also debate in some circles as to whether antidepressants increase the risk of suicide in some patients. This controversy prompted the Food and Drug Administration to take action.
The FDA put a black box warning, first for children and adolescents, and now for all antidepressants, not just SSRIs, for all age groups. And I believe that this was a mistake, because in hastening our awareness, what we've shown is that there's been a marked drop in prescribing of antidepressants, particularly in children and adolescents. And this was highlighted in a Newsweek article recently. With the decrease in prescribing, a clear increase in suicide rates and suicide attempt rates.
In aggregate, I think there's no question that the value of treating, the benefits of treating with medication, and particularly with medication and cognitive behavior therapy, far outweigh these small risks. And those risks can be mitigated if you carefully monitor kids who are on these medications.
A digital alarm clock.
Cognitive behavior therapy is a practical short-term form of talk therapy that provides tools for correcting distorted patterns of thinking. For most people, medications are also helpful, but waiting for them to work can be agonizingly slow.
We saw a reduction in protein kinase.
Here at the National Institute of Mental Health, scientists are working hard to identify faster-acting treatments.
I worry that we've set our sights too low for the treatment of depression. It's hard to find another syndrome in medicine that's characterized by anguish or pain for which you'd say, well, 6 weeks improvement, that's pretty good. Most of the time you want to know about what's going to help you in 2 to 4 to 6 hours.
Recently, in a groundbreaking clinical trial, Dr. Carlos Zarate intravenously administered an experimental drug called ketamine to patients like Carl Gruber, who had suffered from major depression since he was 16 years old.
It's like after a rainstorm when the sun breaks out and all the clouds go away.
The results were dramatic.
When I came out of the infusion, within minutes, I felt my depression lift completely. And the most interesting thing was not only did I no longer feel depressed, I felt as though I had never been depressed.
We didn't have only one or a few symptoms get better in terms of energy, I feel a little bit better. We had complete resolution of symptoms in many patients, and not only that, that the sense of self-esteem and that I am a human being is really restored very rapidly. So the whole essence of the individual is really returned rapidly in a short period of time.
The last major depression I had,
most patients experienced a rapid response because ketamine targets glutamate, a chemical found throughout the brain that interacts with all the mood-influencing chemicals involved in depression.
You know, I felt a very marked lifting of the depression, and not only...
More work needs to be done to determine if ketamine can be used in a safe and effective manner. At a minimum, the findings suggest that targeting the glutamate system may lead to more effective, rapidly acting drugs.
Just as physical pain loses its intense reality once it has been eased, the anguish of profound melancholia evades even the most determined attempts at clear perception.
After checking himself into a psychiatric hospital, Shep Newland found that medication and talk therapy did not help him. His 2 children became his lifeline.
When I was in the hospital and when things were very bad and at their blackest, I would open a drawer, it was an empty drawer, and in that drawer was a picture of those 2 children. And when I looked at that picture, I knew that I had to get better, and I knew that I would get better, and I had to do it for them and would do it for them.
Within a week of his admission, Shep's medical team recommended a frontal lobotomy, a surgical brain procedure that was likely to reduce Shep's distress, but at great personal cost.
The majority of people who've had lobotomies become passive, rather inert intellects for the rest of their lives. It would have been the end of everything creative in me.
Much to Shep's relief, a young resident on the ward intervened and pleaded that electroshock treatments, or ECT, be tried first.
As you can imagine, I leaped at that opportunity rather than have someone put an ice pick between my frontal lobes and the rest of my brain.
At the same time Shep had his ECT, Hollywood was painting a barbaric picture of this procedure in the 1975 movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But for Shep, the procedure did indeed work.
I often visualized it as these snarled wires all enmeshed one in the other, millions of them. And somehow the electroshock therapy burnt the connections away, destroyed the connections, so that if I had a particular thought, it no longer immediately led to a pathological thought, and I was free to be myself again. And I first began to feel a little bit of that at about the 10th or 11th treatment. When I finally did come out of the hospital, I came out of the hospital with nothing, but I was happy. I was happier than I had been in years. Because I knew, somehow I knew, that the bad stuff was over. I think I knew it because I had been about as deep into the depths as anybody could go, and I had those 2 wonderful children. I had what really mattered to me in my life.
ECT has come a long way since the 1970s and is now considered a highly safe and effective treatment, particularly for serious depression. It works especially well among the elderly, whose aging brains and bodies can be less responsive to medications and therapy.
Because you've lost all that weight, when you lose weight, the first thing you go
Sue Powell is here at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, for her 9th electroshock treatment. With no prior history, she was stricken at age 65 with late-onset depression. She found herself becoming confused and irritable.
When you're around someone like this every day, you know, it comes on so gradual until you don't notice it at first. And then as things begin to get progressively worse, then you do begin to notice.
I've always been just an outgoing, bubbly personality. Now, here, listen to me say that about myself, but it's the truth.
Well, it's true.
And then to all of a sudden withdraw and not want to be with your friends or talk or interact in any way and just be downright rude to them, that was just not who I was.
Depression afflicts about 15% of older adults and as many as 25% in nursing homes. Its symptoms can often be mistaken as early signs of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Though the cause of Sue's depression is unclear, she had been diagnosed with high blood pressure, which has been linked to depression in the elderly. Her illness became life-threatening when she stopped eating and lost over 60 pounds. 6 electroshock treatments over a period of several weeks were needed before some improvement was seen.
Ms. Powell, I'd like you to take some nice deep breaths now, okay?
Experts are uncertain how ECT works. What they do know is that it creates a seizure in the brain and may alter the brain's chemical balance. While ECT often works more rapidly than medication, there are possible side effects, including short-term memory loss. There is also the possibility of a relapse. For now, Sue will take medication and have regular checkups every 6 weeks.
The fact is, older people relapse at very high rates. So whereas a younger person, somebody in their 30s who gets depressed, the chances that they'll have another depressive episode sometime in their life are 50-50. An older person who has a lot less of their life to live, the chance that they'll have another depression is about 80%.
She cooks the bread and I wash the dishes. If you had seen her when she came in here and look at her today, she's a different person. She's just back to her old self, and I'm just happy.
But when you first started,
social support, medication, and talk therapy can alleviate the symptoms of depression in the elderly. But for any age group that is treatment resistant, ECT is close to 80% effective.
I think the real travesty is in people who've waited 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You know, why do they wait? One flew over the cuckoo's nest. I mean, there's a stigma associated with ECT. You wait 2, 3, 4 years, though, and a lot of other things have happened in your life. And you've lost a job, you've ruined a relationship. And so people really need to get in and get treatment.
she has improved 100%. Yeah. Really good.
For many people, depression is a chronic illness that can be managed with the appropriate treatment. But what about the 1 million patients who suffer from what is known as treatment-resistant or refractory depression, for whom nothing works? Then what? At age 36, Deanna Benjamin Cole fell into a numbing depression. She could no longer function at work and withdrew from her husband and 3 young children. She spent most of the next 4 years inside this mental hospital in Canada.
At times, it was a very safe place to be, that I wouldn't have been safe somewhere else.
Every possible medical and therapeutic treatment had failed, including 80 electroshock treatments.
It got to the point where I thought everybody would be better off without me, because then they wouldn't have to go through the pain of seeing me feel the way I was feeling. And that's a really, really, really scary place to be.
But one last thread of hope was offered. Working at the frontier of brain research, neurologist Dr. Helen Mayberg had recently made an astonishing discovery with the aid of brain imaging. Mayberg already knew that every depressed patient's brain looked different. There seemed to be no consistent pattern among them. She also knew that most patients showed a decrease in activity in the frontal lobe, the brain's command center. But she noticed in the scans of patients who had recovered from depression, a tiny unmapped region of the brain called Area 25 showed a consistent decrease in activity from a previously elevated state.
What you could see across the various imaging studies, at least to my mind looking at the data, was what had to happen to get well across all of these very different kinds of treatment was turning down that activity in Area 25.
Area 25 sits at a critical intersection in the brain, with pivotal connections to other regions involved in mood, sleep, motivation, and drive.
This brain area is like it's at the core of all things. It's sitting in a place that when it goes wrong, havoc is wreaked.
When patients recovered, Dr. Mayberg noticed that not only did Area 25's activity cool off, but the frontal cortex's activity picked up.
The decrease in 25 tracked with the increase in frontal cortex. It's like they were linked. And this was one of our earliest clues about thinking about a system rather than any one brain area in isolation.
In an effort to pinpoint where moods occur in the brain, Dr. Mayberg conducted an experiment. She asked healthy volunteers to ponder sad thoughts. What she found was that the same system lit up. Area 25 became overactive, while the frontal cortex quieted down. But while healthy volunteers could bounce back quickly from their sad state, depressed patients could not.
And I always say the machinery is in a state. The software is in a bad loop. This is emotion stuck. This is sadness, unbreakable.
I think this idea of...
To Dr. Mayberg, the illness of depression was looking like a circuit board failure. So she decided to surgically target Area 25 in patients like Deanna with the hope of resetting the brain's rhythm.
If you can't talk it down, drug it down, shock it down, maybe you have to do something else in a much more precise, much more bulleted kind of way, if you will.
There you've got a really kind of picture-perfect view on the left side. That is the spot. And that
adapting a technique from the treatment of Parkinson's disease called deep brain stimulation, Dr. Mayberg's team is today treating a patient in a clinical trial at Emory University.
Right. Just kind of register how you're feeling right now and all those things. And if anything changes, you let me know.
Threading 2 electrodes into the brain, the doctors plan to stimulate Area 25 with a steady, low dose of electricity from a pulse generator, similar in concept to a pacemaker.
Ready? Go. You are fast again. Are you actually aware that your speed has been changing? What's going on?
In many patients, subtle but clear changes, including improved motor skills, are immediately noticed in the operating room.
Have you been having this sensation at different settings where there's a change in the apparent?
Occasionally I have noticed that the room gets lighter. It's almost instantaneously lighter, but not instantaneously darker.
Deanna also experienced immediate changes in the operating room.
I was looking at Dr. Mayberg, and all of a sudden I felt that connection that I hadn't felt in over 4 years.
It's as if the brain has been jump-started back to life, then allowing patients to do the hard work of reclaiming their lives.
The surgery was one of the obviously best things, best outcomes. But it doesn't change who I am innately. It doesn't make me a more happy person. It just helped fight through the depression.
Like many heart patients, Deanna now lives with a pulse generator implanted in her chest. But as she explains to people who ask, it does more than just stimulate her brain.
I will say that, it's a pacemaker to help my brain function properly, not my heart. But I guess in a way it does help your heart too, because it makes your heart feel right.
To date, more than 55% of patients participating in this highly experimental treatment have experienced a dramatic improvement in their symptoms.
Helen gave me that chance to live again, to be me, and that is a real gift.
You gonna go to any LSU games this year?
Philip Bugere pursued a variety of treatment avenues: talk therapy, medication, which he says only made his symptoms worse, and a 3-month stay in a hospital. In the end, he believes the most significant contribution to his recovery was the companionship he shared with John Sage, a former All-American football player who was emerging from his own battle with depression.
John Sage, probably more than any other person, saved my life, because I had someone that I could talk to every single day and was there for me, who had gone through what I went through and understood it.
I think it's a question of opening up is the first step to healing. The first baby step is telling one person.
That's right.
And then maybe telling a group of people, or opening up where it's not such a dark, insidious, hidden thing.
You focus internally, and that's part of the disease. You focus on yourself. And it's simple but complicated. Focusing outward on other people is the most important thing you can do if you're depressed.
All the way down to 22. And then once you get that angle.
Today, Philip is vice chairman of the NFL's Houston Texans. He now devotes a third of his time to helping others deal with mental health issues. Philip, like many others, recognizes that limited mental health benefits represent a significant obstacle for people wanting help.
People with mental health problems are discriminated against by the federal government, by state government, by local government, even the Medicare system. You know, it's very limited the amount of mental health care you can get. Every other disease you look at, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, you know, you basically get, you know, at least 80% of your bills paid for. You don't with mental health problems.
Advocating for change, Philip has begun his own campaign within the workplace to improve mental health coverage.
The Houston Texans are the only National Football League team that have mental health parity. If you're going to take care of the whole person, you have to take care of their brain also. When we first started talking, and it wouldn't matter whether it was Cigna or Blue Cross or anybody, about wanting to add mental health benefits to our medical plan, the number's usually around 20%. You know, we're going to charge you 20% more. Now, the truth is they don't have any statistical base to know that, because very few companies have mental health parity. Finally, we negotiated a deal after 6 months where Cigna said we'll charge you 2% more, and then at the end of the year we'll adjust. And guess what? The end of the year adjustment was zero. People use the mental health benefits, but in the overall scheme of things, it didn't affect our rate base at all.
It pays to treat depression. Every year, America loses an estimated $50 billion in productivity as a consequence of untreated depression. Ignoring the treatment of depression also raises the risk of many life-threatening illnesses.
What we're learning now is that people with depression are also at higher rates for diabetes, for cardiovascular death. We now know that there are changes in bone density, that osteoporosis is higher in people who have depression. So this is, yes, it's a brain disorder, but in some sense it's a multi-system, whole-body disorder. Not surprising then that people often present with more somatic symptoms than with just the psychological manifestations.
It would take Ellie nearly 4 months to start to feel better from her postpartum depression.
She was just in such deep despair that, you know, I literally told her at least 20 times a day that you're gonna get through this. You're gonna, you know, and you asked about 10 times a day, I think.
At least.
Am I gonna get through this? Yes, yes. And you did. So.
During her ordeal, Ellie noticed that her maternal bond with Graham was suffering.
I was physically unable to have an expressive face with him and to be able to really smile at him. And when he did start to smile, he never smiled at me. And that was absolutely devastating.
All right, Graham, what should we get? Hello.
At the time, Ellie was taking several medications that forced her to give up her plans to breastfeed Graham for a year.
I was taking a lot of different medications, and I felt really guilty about that because I needed to stop breastfeeding.
A website on healthy childhood development gave her a broader perspective.
Mom puts on the still face. And Michael tries everything he can to reestablish connection.
It just breaks my heart to see those video clips, though, because first of all, it hits way too close to home. And secondly, you can just feel the pain that those children are experiencing.
The website helped Ellie to realize that treating her depression would not only help her, but minimize Graham's risk of becoming depressed.
Well, we know depression runs in families, and we know that the children of depressed parents have high rates of depression. And one new finding is that if you treated the mother to remission, the children who had symptoms got better.
I think there are a lot of reasons why you got blindsided by...
Today, Ellie and Jeffrey are meeting with Dr. Kim because they hope to have another child.
Honestly, I'd be really sad if Graham didn't have a little sibling to play with. And so frankly, it's partially out of love for Graham that we want to have another child.
This time, as a protective measure, Ellie will stay on a low dose of an antidepressant. Prior to the birth of Graham, she had experienced a few episodes of depression. This history puts her at higher risk for another postpartum depression.
In your particular case, you've had more than one episode of major depression. You've had, a couple. And so your risk of another episode off of an antidepressant is, more than 80–90%. So it's quite high.
I just want to do whatever I can to not have the repeat of last time.
With medication and support in place, Ellie's chance of experiencing another postpartum depression is dramatically reduced.
It's hard to look past.
But it is Ellie's trust in Dr. Kim's care that gives her the most confidence to go forward with another pregnancy.
I think one of the ways that we can keep depression in remission has to do with the relationship between the therapist and the patient. And if you're seeing somebody and you don't think it's a good match, you're the consumer, you ought to go out and find somebody different to treat you.
If you're feeling like something might be, like you're depressed or things aren't right, get help. And if the help doesn't help you, then get different help and don't give up. And I think the most important thing is that you will recover. You will be okay. This is an incredibly treatable condition. Just don't, whatever you do, don't give up. Love you.
Not long after Jawi was released from prison, he wrote a letter to Terry Williams, who decided to mentor him through the Stay Strong Foundation, an organization she co-founded to help at-risk youth.
What Terry did with me is one of the most noble things I've ever witnessed in my life. Terry met me when I got right out of prison. She read my story, she felt it, and she invited me to her house. I've never experienced nothing like that in my life.
I decided to mentor this extraordinary young man, Jawi, because I felt that he was a promise for the future.
I've never believed that people are born evil. And when I hear stories about so-and-so being a monster who's committed a horrific crime, I always say, if we knew their story, we would understand. He has a tender spirit, but he hasn't always found the way to expose that to very many people. I love Jawi. Please welcome Jawi.
Jawi has written a book about his life and hopes to inspire others through his writing.
He's a window into the pain that so many are in, because our kids are out there parenting themselves because their parents are in pain. They didn't get certain things, so we have generation after generation after generation who are wounded and have never gotten any help.
The first thing Terry did was to get Jawi the professional help he needed.
Nightmares? Every night. Can't do it without help.
In addition to depression, Jawi suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Think of the exact moment you heard that your homie was murdered.
A big part of me wants to do what's the norm, or do what I'm supposed to be doing. Getting revenge. The other part of me is telling me that the cycle has to stop.
People who have trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder left untreated long enough start to fall into depression. The fact is that trauma is very healable now. We have techniques that really can affect directly where the trauma is held in the brain, can identify it, can help to process and release it.
I would guess I would say as far as the stress.
Jawi refuses medication for his depression, but a preliminary study suggests that talk therapy is the most effective treatment for depressed patients with a history of early trauma.
Just a few things that I get, a psychotherapist, like just something as small as that would mean a lot to an individual on the street. And we have no proper way to extract none of those feelings. And the only way we learn to do that, that's where our therapy becomes the bottle, our therapy become pills, our therapy become crime, violence, drugs. That be our therapy because it's what relieve what we're going through.
We pay for not caring about those who are not properly nourished. They are your worst nightmare. They will show up in your neighborhoods. They will show up anywhere and everywhere if we don't do our part.
Like before meeting Terry, I still was lost and confused, still roaming around in the dark, and like she just shed light on my darkness just to have that connection, and it's like a second mother, you know what I'm saying? And I think it kills me because I know we all need that.
I want to embarrass you. I love you. He's a young man who's going to change the world. He's taking his pain and his challenges and sharing it.
There's a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in this world. But you know something? It's also a beautiful world. There are enormous rewards available to every one of us. And to cheat oneself of those rewards is unfair not only to ourselves, but to everyone who really cares about us. And it's unfair to the world. I think we owe the world something. Part of repairing the world, part of making it better, is to be better oneself.
After losing their son to suicide at age 20, the Sate visited the president of his college in Arizona.
We spoke to the president of his school, who was a very intelligent and sensitive man. And he more or less looked at us and said, I have 38,000 students. What could I do? What could I have done? And we walked away saying, this is what we have to do.
The Sate House launched the JED Foundation nationwide to prevent suicide and promote mental health on college campuses.
Just that experience of trying to find...
The foundation provides resources to over 1,200 colleges and also partners with MTVU, rock stars, and college students in its web campaign.
One feels that you're helping others. At least you're doing something positive, trying to, as a friend says, trying to create some sort of victory out of a tragedy.
The illness of depression is highly complex. It takes many shapes and requires just as many individualized approaches for its treatment. For many living with depression, including Andrew, friends and loved ones are strong medicine.
These experiences of darkness make the light more beautiful. That the pain of being acutely depressed allows you to experience an unbelievable happiness in every day when you aren't depressed, and a sense of each of those days as a gift. So that's the real message of hope, is that you can get better, and when you do get better, not that you'll look back on it with great longing, but you may look back on it and think, I learned a lot by going through that, and I'm a better person because I did it.
After 5 years, the Lipton family feels they have arrived at the right combination of medication and a supportive environment to keep heart on an even keel.
I think in all of this, if we could just accept that this is real, that it's medical, and we share the reality and destigmatize the illness, we could probably cure it faster. What's heart like this fall compared to last year, compared to the year before? And in the longer view, I mean, he's doing great. He's doing more and better, and he's feeling better, and he's taking on more.
I've had a number of people ask me if they can pay me to paint pieces just in their house and on cars and stuff, and that's something. At my age, I would say there's probably a lot coming that I have to look forward to.
Boring and horrifying.
Andrew's first major episode of depression came without warning.
I was going about my ordinary life. It was right when I was publishing my first novel, and it had kind of nice reviews, and I just didn't care. And I remember thinking, that's so strange that this is happening and I don't care, but I just didn't. My closest friend threw a wonderful book party for me, and I remember walking into that party and feeling as though it was so hard just to walk in there, and all these people were coming up and they were excited for me and excited to be there and they wanted to talk, and I couldn't hold them in focus. I was sitting there and they were kind of, I could see them and then I suddenly couldn't see them anymore, and it was just as if I was surrounded by this big blur. And then the anxiety began. I was terrified all the time, but I didn't know what I was terrified of, so there was nothing I could do about it. It was like that feeling if you've slipped and tripped in that second before you fall flat on your face on the floor. And it was like that all the time, 24 hours a day. And I finally got to the point at which it was too frightening for me to move out of my bed, and I was just sitting there in this huddled mess.
Desperate for help, Andrew turned to his father.
My father said to me to move back in, and I thought, I can't move into my father's house. I'm 30 years old. How can I be doing this? But I did it. I moved back in, and he was incredibly caretaking. And I remember sitting there and being too tired and too overwhelmed to cut up the meat on my plate, and my father cutting up my meat for me the way that I sometimes do for my nephew who's 6. And by saying to my father, I can't believe I have to ask you to do this.
Andrew's breakdown was cushioned by the support of his family. But it was the loss of his mother to cancer 3 years earlier that he believes significantly contributed to his depression.
I knew that the loss of my mother was a cataclysmic loss, and I really experienced a lot of my own happiness in the context of her happiness, because when something went really well for me, she would be so incredibly happy for me, and that would magnify my own happiness.
Many of them terrified to step out of the shadows and seek help.
Funding for Depression Out of the Shadows has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding provided by the Ritter Foundation Incorporated and Mental Insight Foundation. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
I knew that the sun was rising and setting, but little of its light reached me. I felt myself sagging under what was much stronger than I. First, I could not use my ankles, and then I could not control my knees, and then my waist began to break under the strain, and then my shoulders turned in, and in the end, I was compacted and fetal, depleted by this thing that was crushing me without holding me. I had thought that when you feel your worst, your tears flood, but the very worst pain is the arid pain of all used up. The pain that stops up every space through which you once metered the world, or the world you. This is the presence of major depression.
Andrew Solomon became an expert and best-selling author on the subject of depression after enduring several debilitating episodes of major depression that started in his 30s.
I always say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. and that depression has to do with finding all of life totally overwhelming. It's a poverty of the English language that we only have that one word, depression, that's used to describe how a little kid feels when it rains on the day of his baseball game, and it's also used to describe why people spend their lives in mental hospitals and end up killing themselves. But clinical depression really has to do with the feeling that you can't do anything, that everything is unbelievably difficult, that life is completely terrifying, and a feeling of this free-floating despair, which is overpowering.
I want so much for simple things. Wellness, happiness, family togetherness. I wish I could answer why this is happening. Sometimes I really and truly feel like I'm going crazy. And why, when I am so surrounded with love, do I feel so alone? And right now, no one can say that I haven't tried. I have. I'm scared.
If you think about the worst you have ever felt in your life, and imagine feeling that way every day and not knowing why, then you'll know what depression is.
You feel it as anguish in your chest. You feel it in every one of your bones and ligaments. You feel a heaviness and moving.
Depression is a perplexing illness that takes many forms.
Depression tortures you every day with the idea that you suffer and somehow I ought to be able to do something about it, and I can't.
Depression is an illness of loneliness, and the primary experience is the feeling of being isolated, of being alone, of being cut off from everyone and everything.
It can strike early in life or as late as our twilight years. Trauma, loss, or neglect can lead to depression in those who are vulnerable.
Our therapy becomes the bottle. Our therapy become pills. Our therapy become crime, violence.
Genetics also plays a role.
The major risk factor is having a family history of depression.
Very anxious and very depressed because I don't think I can do this anymore.
Treatment is an ongoing process of trial and error.
If you can't talk it down, drug it down, chalk it down, maybe you have to do something else in a much more bulleted kind of way, if you will.
Scientists are hard at work, piecing together a better understanding of the many faces of depression.
If someone can get the appropriate treatment and stay with it, the prognosis is actually very, very good.
Meanwhile, over 20 million Americans are living with depressive disorders. Many
us so much, and when she died, it was as though I had lost that sounding board.
Facing a painful terminal illness, Andrew's mother made the decision to end her life on her own terms.
She had a couple of prescriptions of Seconal that had been written for her, and we all went into her room, and she spread them out on her bed, and I remember thinking they looked almost like some kind of a game, all of those red pills spread out on the counterpane, and she began taking them a few at a time, and she had thought through exactly what she wanted to say to each one of us, and she looked at my father and she said, even with this ending, she said, I wouldn't change this life for any other life in the world. And then she looked around at all of us and she said, I've looked for so many things in this life, so many things, and all the time paradise was in this room with the three of you. And then she closed her eyes. And that was the last thing she said.
In some cases, the loss of a loved one can be a tipping point into depression.
Depression is a biological disorder. It's not all in your head. But the triggers of depression and whether you have an episode and when you have an episode or an onset are probably related to environmental factors. And those are loss of attachments and stress and loss in your life.
For Emma, The onset of her depression was not tied to a single event. Her symptoms unfolded early, beginning at age 11.
I started feeling kind of lonely and just separate from the other kids. I thought all my friends were feeling the same way, that it was just kind of a part of life and that I was just weak because I couldn't deal with it.
The onset of clinical depression most typically presents itself between the ages of 15 to 34. But the disease is often missed in adolescence because it can be mistaken for normal teenage behavior.
I mean, they talk about on those depression surveys, have you lost interest in things you used to enjoy? And I never really understood that because I didn't remember ever enjoying anything. It's like, you know, the Dementors in Harry Potter, how they kind of suck all the happiness out of you. They suck all your good memories. It's like the world goes cold.
When we're talking about clinical depression, we mean depression that goes on for several weeks, in which the symptoms happen almost every single day. So what are these symptoms? There's feeling sad and blue, feeling guilty, feeling hopeless and helpless, having problems of sleeping and eating, and feeling life is just not worth living.
You imagine as a parent that it would never happen to your kid. Here we are, an intact family, no divorce, no history of depression.
Emma masked behavior she herself did not understand.
I don't know how much I necessarily, lied to them, before things started getting really bad. I just wasn't completely honest. I started getting depressed in, 5th grade, and I didn't say anything until I was about to be a sophomore in high school.
The signs that you would look for, like doing bad in school or being isolated, the stuff you would read in a textbook, we didn't see anything like that. It was just, on the surface, everything was doing great. And then it was like a meteorite just smashed into our house.
I was really good at playing the role that I felt like I was supposed to play.
So that's the trap I think parents can fall into, which is we have such high expectations of our kids. The kids meet those expectations outwardly, even while they're crumbling inwardly.
As time went on, Emma's symptoms escalated. To the outside world, she was just a teenager acting out.
I started drinking. That kind of got a little bit out of hand. My friends told me that I was drinking too much, and they told me to try to stop drinking. And I found that it wasn't easy to stop drinking, so I started smoking pot a lot. And I was going to take a bottle of Tylenol and split my wrists or something along those lines. But instead, I was like, no, you have to do something about this. And I basically went downstairs and told my dad, I was just like, I want to kill myself. And he was kind of trying to talk to me well, what's going on? Why do you feel so sad? And I just started screaming and crying, and I just fell over onto the floor, and he picked me up, kind of holding me up so I wouldn't drag on the floor, and was like, what did you take? What did you take? And I was like, I didn't take anything. This is me sober. He still thinks I was high that night when we talked, but I was just so horribly depressed.